In this tutorial, we will learn how to add a motion blur to any moving object in Blender. This is available both for cycles as well as Eevee engine, and it can create a dramatic effect in your scene if correctly used. We will look into this particular example later. Let us first take this default scene and implement a simple motion blur for this. We will move the default cube along this x-axis and then test a motion blur on the cube. Right now we are at frame number 1, so let us insert a keyframe for its current X location from here. Then we will go to say frame number 100. We need to move the cube along the x-axis to some distance. Let's say we move it here. So we will change its X location to 40. We have to also keyframe it. Now if we run the animation from the beginning, the cube moves along this way. And somewhere in the middle, let us say we go to frame number 50. And here, we will render this particular frame. In cycles, you can see motion blur in the viewport when it is enabled, but in Eevee, the motion blur won't be visible in this viewport, it will show only in the render. However, we did not add any motion blur yet. So we get just an ordinary output, there is no motion blur here. Let us now add the motion blur. So go to the Render Properties tab and scroll down. We have the motion blur here, let us enable this and then expand it. We will first go with the default options here. Let us hit F12 for the render again. We now get an effect like this. So you can see some amount of motion blur for this cube along its direction of movement, which is the x-axis of our composition. You can control the amount of the blur and its nature using these parameters here. First, in this position field, if we use the Start on Frame option, the camera shutter will open at the current frame. It will capture this frame as well as its next frame and blend it with the current frame to give us kind of a weighted average of the two frames, you can say, for the blur. If we change it to Center on Frame, Blender will use the current frame and its previous frame and also the next frame to get an average of the 3 frames here. So we get to see a bit of its past and also a bit of its future position in the output. And if we use End on Frame, then the camera shutter will virtually close at this frame while capturing the scene from its previous frame. So technically, its previous frame will be blended with the current frame to create the blur effect. Among these 3 options, in my opinion, you can use the Center on Frame option, it's good for most of the cases. Then this shutter value determines the amount of influence of the previous frames, or the next frames, for the blur effect. Based on this value, Blender will create the blur, using its previous frames, or its future positions. You can keep it as 1 for a better effect, but please reduce it down if your objects are moving very fast. We will keep the background separation as 100, no need to change. You can increase this max blur, if you want to artificially increase the blur amount. This is simply the highest distance in number of pixels that the blur will occupy around the object boundary. And this step value determines the number of iterations. The value of 1 is mostly sufficient, but if your object has a very complex topology, you may need to increase this, which will also increase the rendering time. So, we have changed the shutter value to 1, let us render this and verify. Or maybe, we can also increase this value to 64. And with this, let us render it again. So, you can see that this time we have more amount of blur added to the cube due to its motion. An effect like this may not be very important for slow-moving objects, but they can come handy when the objects are moving very fast. You can also use this for the trail of a comet, or to create a supernatural character, or yet another use case is, when you want to take a still frame, like a time-stop photography. A blur effect for your moving objects can add much more realism in the still frame renders. We will also look at another example of this, but the important thing is, you should experiment with these values, and find out the best settings for your particular scene where you want to use a blur effect. This example is taken directly from the Blender Foundation. We have many cube objects already added into this scene. If we go to the rendered view mode, we can also see some nice colors for the cubes scattered on the floor, and we will first render this scene as it is, without any motion blur effect. So, we get something like this. It is an ordinary scene, there is no motion blur here, quite as expected. Now we will add the motion blur into this scene. So go to the Render Properties and enable the Motion Blur option. Let us go with these default options only. So hit F12 to get the render output. And we get a nice result with the blur effect. The scene has now dramatically changed, and you can see that all the objects have got some blur, but the amount is not the same for all. This is because the blur is proportional to the instantaneous velocity of each object, so faster moving objects have more blur. I hope you like this tutorial. Thanks for watching, and we created many more such useful tutorials, so don't forget to subscribe to this channel.